everyone. Great. Sorry about that. I don't know if you can hear me properly. All right. So as has been introduced, I'm here to talk about electric scooters. I'm not a hugely technical, just before we start, I'm not a hugely technical guy. So if you have exceptionally technical questions, I'd ask that I can certainly find the answer for you, but I'm unlikely to have it off the top of my head. So please just bear that in mind. Other than that, I'm here to talk to you about electric scooters in general, a little bit about the technology behind them, and then the social and environmental impact of these devices. As mentioned, they are exceptionally big overseas. There's not much going on with them over here and basically in the developing world at all. But in Europe and the US, they are big deals in terms of a ride-sharing platform. But I'll elaborate on that in a moment. So as I mentioned, I'm going to briefly walk you through the technical breakdown of a typical example of an electric scooter. Then we can look at their effect on society and this whole notion of how much better for the environment are they compared to a car or something like that. So if we look over here, this is the motor type that they basically uniformly use. They all use brushless hub motors. If you look back at the research before, and what appears to be the case was that the battery technology wasn't really there to support something like this until 4 or 5 years ago. But there's been quite a lot of thought and research and stuff into this. As I mentioned, they've kind of all universally settled on the brushless hub motor, but originally it was between this and a almost inline transmission type motor, which was much lighter, but of course meant that didn't really fit with the scooter as you see it here. And so in the end, they've gone along with this. So depending on the quality of the scooter that you're looking at, it's just a variation of this in some other form. Okay, if you get a moment, there we go. Now, if you are a keen observer, you'll notice that it is slightly different to the one before you right now. That's simply because the technology is moving so quickly. That the one in front of me here was new as of the beginning of 2018, and already by mid-2019 has been completely phased out overseas. That's just sort of what we've seen in this market with the scooters. Just as the technology develops, they move through quite quickly. So the specs that we're looking at here are for the latest one, but you'll be given an opportunity to test drive the one right here. They all appear to be fairly standard across the industry. Quality and power and stuff like that comes in other spaces. So looking at a range of between 20 and 30 kilometers, it's fairly dependent on your size and your weight. As to what you'll get, and of course how you treat the battery. I believe this is also a fairly standard battery, and the weight is highly critical on something like this. So the magnesium alloy is again pretty standard across the industry. Some of them use, I believe it was airline aluminium instead of the alloy, but again, it's very much a weight thing and a price thing. As to the technicals, I will give you more details on this one before we do the test drive, but in general, that is kind of the space in which these scooters are operating. There are rapid advancements. In particular, these are highly dependent on the quality of the battery, and it's believed that when solid state batteries, I don't know if I'm saying that right, instead of lithium ion batteries are more available, that it'll have a massive effect on what you can and can't do with these scooters. If we look back, the ones from 5 or 6 years ago had lead acid batteries, and effectively you were hauling around a car battery on the back of a scooter like this, which of course is why, if you look back in time, or if you take a gander, there was almost nothing to do with electric scooters prior to lithium ion becoming so prominent. If we move on to their effect, and I mean, we've already discussed what they were up to in Germany. The model that has been adopted overseas is a rideshare one, similar to Uber. So you download an app on your phone, it shows you where the nearest scooter is, and you hop on and off you go. It's been met with varying degrees of praise and criticism. Initially, they rolled it out with no consultation with authorities or anything like that, and that was met very poorly, but subsequently there's been a lot of drive to integrate it, to work with authorities. For example, with Oktoberfest, which we've already discussed, it was agreed between the government and the companies that made it available that they would geofence Oktoberfest. So the scooters couldn't be turned on or turned off within a certain range, which I think from a transportation point of view is a very interesting thing to consider. So you couldn't pick one up if you were within a certain range of Oktoberfest, but you also couldn't get off one if you were in a certain range, because you couldn't disable it. So you couldn't stop it charging your account until you were a certain distance away from Oktoberfest, in order to kind of prevent people from bringing them in, using them inappropriately and stuff like that. From that point of view, if we just look at how that shapes the ability to do that, to effectively, imagine if you could stop cars turning off in Sandton if you wanted to reduce congestion so that you had to keep driving. So if we consider that, I think from a future point of view, that's a very interesting addition to how transport integrates to our network. I'm going to discuss one of the reports. As of yet, it is a fairly new thing, so there's not a huge amount of extremely credible data out there. I have tried to stick within the ones that are the most credible. This one in particular is considered to be one of the better reports, and it comes from Portland in the US, where instead of there being no engagement, and this was in 2017 when there was very limited engagement between the companies and authorities, they invited all of the companies to come in on condition that they allow them to generate data off of it. As we can see here, the idea of these scooters is not necessarily a toy. And most people that use them in their everyday lives didn't use them as toys. They were used predominantly during commuting hours and as a way to get to and from work, as a part of the last mile problem, which is it comes out of a logistics space, but really the cost of that last mile for transporting any good equals to 28 to 30% of the total cost of the journey, because of course now it has to be separated from mass transit and sent off on its own. And these scooters are hailed internationally as kind of the solution to that last mile problem. So you can jump on a train and get 90% of the way, and then instead of either having to use a car instead of the train full stop, or catching an Uber or something like that, that last way, you'd hop onto one of these at the extremely minimal cost, and off you'd go. As you can see from the data, what has been quite interesting is what it replaced. So when people were asked, if you used the scooter on this trip, what would you have used instead? The highest percentage was, unfortunately, people would have walked if they didn't have access to scooters, but shortly behind that was cars and Ubers in conjunction. What was very interesting that came out of this is 6% of regular users reported selling their cars. Now, that's extremely major if you consider what a car means to all of us in South Africa. It's exceptional to consider giving up that option. Now, I believe, and I will discuss it in more detail, that these people didn't replace every car trip they had with a scooter now, having sold it. But what it meant was, given the other infrastructure developing, or the other infrastructure available to them, trains, buses, it no longer made sense to have a car. I would guess that the profile of these people were people that were already trying to use public transport and so on, but were kind of forced to use their car just because public transport didn't get them close enough or near enough to what they would to where they needed to go, or it wasn't the timing of public transport didn't suit them. But with the addition of this one thing to the network, suddenly you see this massive drop in car use. And I think that that's what these scooters offer most powerfully, is they feed into existing networks and strengthen them in such a way that you can almost start to consider moving away from a car. If we look at the injuries and the safety perception, I think there's still quite a negative perception around the scooters and how unsafe they are. The CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control in America, in conjunction with Austin, did a study on safety around e-scooters. As mentioned already, 32% of all injuries occur the first time you get onto it, and the longer you use them, the less frequent the injuries are. The perception is you're going to get hit and killed by a car. Mostly you're just going to fall off on your own. You're not going to hit anything. With car injuries only accounting for about 10%. What was extremely interesting was that only less than 1% of all people injured reported wearing a helmet. And if you look at the new legislation coming out of Germany, which is the first country to actually have an act around micro-mobility, while they have rules and regulations around drinking and driving, they don't require users to wear a helmet, which I think is quite interesting. And as we discussed, what has been very interesting coming out of this is the fact that you can't discount the price of fun. Scooters typically cost slightly more than an Uber to cover the same distance, and yet what was found was that people preferred them to Ubers. And what I'm chalking it up to, and what researchers kind of chalked it up to, is it's more fun. It's cooler to go on a scooter than it is to jump into an Uber, and people are willing to pay the slight premium. I think it's in the US, it's $1 or so more for the same distance if you're going between 1 and 2 kilometers. And yet people are willing to pay that premium because it's fun. Right, so then what so far most of the companies, Bird, Lime, Bolt, have purported is that it's better for the environment. Almost none of them have been willing to qualify that statement, but others have done the research. If we look very simply in terms of if you rode this 1 kilometer versus if you drove your car 1 kilometer, what would be the carbon output of just the usage? And as you can see, it's extremely low. So on its own, that is very significant. And you could argue that this is much, much better for the environment. If you look at what they assumed in Portland, I believe that 122 metric tons is equivalent to 27 mid-sized cars being in operation for a year. So that is fairly significant. However, the wheels start to fall off here in this rideshare model. For one thing, because the scooters are accessible and effectively dumped all over the country, all over the show, someone has to pick them up in a car, and that of course hurts the emissions. They also, unfortunately, as soon as it's a rental model, have notoriously low life. With the very first generation of these scooters, which early 2018, most of them lasting less than 28 days before they were unusable. Having said that, if we look at the graph and we break it down, I hope you can see it somewhat. What we have in the first column on your left is a typical mid-sized car. And if you look on the far right, that is an electric scooter, worst case scenario. And that's looking at the carbon output per kilometer. So they're about equivalent. And if we can break that down and look at it, I'll hope to explain why. The green bar represents being picked up, the coming and going, the transition of it. The orange bar is the use. the day-to-day. If you look at the damage a car does to the environment, it's almost all seated in just using it every day, whereas the scooter is extremely low. The red represents the cost of the battery and the disposal, what it took to make it, and so on. Again, it's present in both, but it's much higher in the scooter. The reason being, of course, because these scooters don't last very long in the rideshare model, because if you don't own it, you don't treat it well, as appears to be the case. And the manufacturer of is, I think, in blue. Again, because cars can last 10, 15 years, no, even longer, it doesn't even appear on the graph for the car's damage, but it is present for the scooter because of the shortness of the life. When looking at this, it's easy to kind of write them off as something that appears green, but on closer examination, that's not the case. However, what is very significant to this is ownership rather than rental. So when that research is applied, or when those metrics are applied to the ownership model, ownership can typically last up to 3 or 4 years without having to replace anything major. As opposed to 28 days, you can of course travel much further. If we go back to the graph, that brings down the cost of the battery over its lifetime very significantly. Again, it's the life of the scooter. So because a car lasts so long, they're not as comparable because you can write off almost all of the manufacturer costs. And finally, unlike with a car, the generation source plays an effect. If you charge this, if you set up a little solar panel and you charge this, then of course you could completely mitigate the environmental detriment of the actual grid that you used. In general, they are better for the environment, but as I said, prefaced with how they are used and how they're operated. Again, a lot of this data is generated from the early days of the rideshare. I believe that it has gotten better, that there's less dumping of the scooters, which was also a contributing factor, and that they are working quite hard to improve the life of them, because, as I'm sure you can no doubt guess, it's very hard to build a business when your assets last less than a month. Anyway, I thought we'd just end off with a brief look at EV in general, because they are so linked. So having just come back from the Smarter Mobility Conference in Pretoria, what I can say is the discussion around there, as of I think it was April this year, we've only managed to sell 1,000 electric vehicles in South Africa, like personal ones. There remains to be an exceptionally high import duty, which is one of the contributing factors, 25% import duty on electric vehicles. If you compare that to a 1,000 cc or less internal combustion engine, which has a 0% import duty in this country. So there are definitely things that remain in the way of these technologies progressing. We are rolling out charging stations, but as of yet, short of going on the main highway between Joburg and Cape Town and within the city, you won't be able to take your electric vehicle anywhere without also bringing your diesel generator to charge it, which I think defeats the object of the. It'll be interesting to see where this goes going forward. I believe that there's no doubt that electric vehicles are going to come in a big way, but in South Africa, I think there are a few key things that still need to change before we are looking at mass rollout of electric vehicles. In terms of the aftermarket, what is particularly interesting is the number of moving parts in an electric vehicle's motor compared to the internal combustion engine. What I found when I was looking all of this up was that there are around 20, and of the 10 most commonly replaced parts in an internal combustion engine, 9 didn't even feature in an electric vehicle, and the one that did was the charging cap or petrol cap. So we're looking at a very different space in terms of vehicle ownership. They need far less maintenance, about a third as much, and far less regularly. And when they do, it's minor until we come to the discussion of the battery, which, as it stands now, unfortunately, to replace is between 40 and 60% of the total cost of the entire vehicle. It'll be interesting to see what it means for employment. Of course, there's, as we discussed, some of you discussed with me outside, the aftermarket for parts is greatly diminished compared to an internal combustion engine, and the servicing required is so much less that it almost means that service centers will have to change how they operate. Finally, and what I thought was an interesting note to end this discussion on, is in a few places, the massive electric trucks are able to operate completely without charge, as long as the payload is at the top of a hill, and the depot or the drop-off point is at the bottom of the hill. And then through regenerative braking, there are several instances of where these trucks effectively never have to be recharged. If you check it out online, there are a few quarries that are doing it, and I believe that there are a couple of dairy farms also that have successfully managed to run their vehicles without ever having to stop and charge them, which is just the most fascinating thing, and such an advocate for where we could go with this. Imagine being able to claim that of a petrol vehicle. There's no other transportation technology out there that can almost be neutral to the grid like electric. So that's me in general. Before we close, here are the specs of the scooter in front of you, just so that you get a sense of it. In comparison to the specs that I showed earlier, those are for the kind of everyday scooter. This happens to be one of the top of the range ones. So if you look, you can see that there are some slight variations. It charges faster, it can go further. But as we found, that range is almost completely meaningless. If you're going 45 Ks on your scooter in one day, then good for you. But almost all of the research has indicated that people never go more than 2 kilometers in a single trip and are unlikely to do more than 10 Ks in a day. That's not really their purpose. The purpose of these is to integrate with other things. It's to get in and around Sandton, for example, or the inner city, rather than to take you from the suburbs into Sandton. And if we can end off on that note, that's really what we're advocating here. It's not replacing any one mode of transport. It's integrating into the existing network in such a way that it makes it possible for you to choose something like public transport or a more environmentally conscious way of getting around, and it remain convenient, because people in general will not adapt or will not change to anything unless it is more convenient than what they are currently offered with. So if we can move on to questions, and then anyone interested, you are able to give it a test drive outside. Got a nice quiet road. As I'll reiterate it, most injuries occur the first time you use it, so please don't soil my record of having no one injured on this thing so far. Yeah, okay. It is an option, so you can put a seat on it, yes. Yeah.
I just see the weight for the last one. The previous one was 100 kgs. The last one is 150 kgs. So I think it's getting there for some of us.
Yes, so it does depend on what you want. This particular brand, I think the one version can accommodate up to 140 kilograms. And people have done all sorts of interesting things with them. I've seen pictures of guys bolting basically just a bracket on the back and delivering their pizzas on this thing. So it's been very interesting to get involved and to see what the guys are doing with it. I've also seen one where they stripped 3 and put all of the lithium-ion batteries onto one, taped them to the side, and then were able to seriously make the thing move. Someone else had a question? Yeah.
I've got 2 questions. The first one is, what's the cost of one? Is it available to anyone to buy, or?
So these ones in particular, it's hard to say. In terms of legislation, there's nothing in South Africa. So the import codes are still somewhat vague. We are working on it. So to give a rand figure is a little bit hard. These range, if you were to procure it in the US, between about $500 and $1,000, depending on what you're trying to get out of it. I believe that the rideshare ones that have exploded all over the world are at a much lower grade. So you get it between $100 and $200, and I'm sure they're getting it for a fraction of that. And your second question?
Okay, and then the other thing is, where they're being used now, is that, are they allowed on the road, like the normal road with cars, or is it only for specific?
So it depends where you are. Germany is the best example because they've actually legislated for it. In Germany, if there is a bicycle track available, you have to ride the scooter on that. Otherwise, it's on the main road, not on highways, and never on the sidewalk. Typically, the research indicates that people are most comfortable riding it on the actual road, and will only use the sidewalk if traffic is unpredictable or moving at above 60 kilometers an hour. So that's kind of been the data. Of course, more injuries occur as soon as it's used on the pavement as opposed to on the road.
But if you import one like that, will you be able to register it to use it on the road in South Africa, for instance?
So there is nothing to that effect yet in this country. So it's kind of a gray area. My advice to all interested is wear a helmet and then you're doing everything right. There's nothing to say that it's not road legal. Is that another question? No.
Any more questions? Did they discuss the new electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, which seems to be coming out in the mobility conference as well? There's a company called Lilium in Germany that's doing some very interesting things.
It wasn't discussed when at the conference I was at. I'm sure it's all coming. There are so many developments in this space that it's very much fighting for airtime, I suppose. Yeah.
So in terms of maintenance, if you do have a breakdown, you call AA or...
So it's actually all very minor. So I would say the worst case scenario is that you run out of battery far from anywhere else and you have to carry the thing. Other than that, in terms of the maintenance plan and what you get with it, it's basically the alignment of the discs, making sure that the bearings are sitting properly, stuff like that. I would strongly advise that you don't try and wheelie the thing because the battery is, of course, on the underside, and so when you come down, you'll come down on the battery. Other than that, maintenance is extremely limited. Eventually, you'll wear down the brakes, but again, the reports coming in are, unless you did something silly on it, it's very minor, and you can almost always do it yourself. Especially if you're an engineer and know not to perforate the battery when you're screwing the board back in, which is apparently one of the major complaints from the OEMs. Yeah?
I want to know, what do they charge on a ride per minute rather than the middle of the kilometer distance?
So I think it's an activation fee of just...
In Detroit, it's $1.
Yes.
$1 to activate.
Yeah.
Per minute is 50 cents. So I want to know why they charge per minute rather than per distance.
Because the distances are so low. So I believe that what it is people are only going a kilometer or two. So if you saw that it was, I believe that the average trip comes in at $5 or $6. But of course, if you were told that it was $3 a kilometer or something like that.
$1 to unlock it.
Yes, no. What I'm saying is I think the reason they've gone with that model in comparison to charging per distance is that per distance appears to be a higher figure in people's minds. That would be my guess, why they've done it like that. I also know that it's a almost all of them have adapted a version where you have to park it in an appropriate place, and I believe that the cost like that has implications for that, where they actually want to encourage you not to just abandon the thing in the middle of nowhere or something like that. Yeah.
I also assume it will be because if it was per distance and people will make stops and it will basically, the company will lose out.
Quite possibly as well.
Then you won't prioritize getting from point A to point B.
Yes.
Just drive it around.
Any other questions? This version doesn't have regenerative braking, but the newer ones all do. On, I think, the latest one of this particular brand, I believe it's just on one of the wheels. Yeah.
So the specs you showed us now on the page, was that for this model?
This right here, yes.
But the specs you showed earlier, the range was only 20 to 30.
Yes, so this is a very high-end one. So the typical one for your use was, as I said, and as the manufacturers have said, it's not, the actual range is not that important because it doesn't have a long charge time. And almost no one, when we've looked at the surveys, almost no one reports going more than 5Ks in a single trip. Even that was an outlier. So when you're paying a premium for range that you're almost guaranteed to never hit, I believe that's why. So on the newer version of this one, the range is, I think, also up there, 40, 50 kilometers. But again, you're paying for something that to the typical user wouldn't get any utility out of.
Electric bicycles are also quite popular. How do you use the scooter over a bicycle?
So the scooter is quite compact. So that's one thing. You can fold it up, put it away, so you can put it under your seat, put it in the boot, something like that. Electric bicycles are significantly more expensive. That we do have a rand value for. And if you're looking at a proper one from a bicycle shop, you're looking in the 100,000 rand region. In terms of user profile, what we found to be quite interesting is if you're a cyclist and you're given access to one of these, you remain a cyclist. And if you preferred scooters, you don't make the transition to bicycles. When we've talked to the bicycle shops in South Africa that are selling electric bicycles, they found that it's already cyclists. Only cyclists are particularly interested in it. Even if they're using it to commute to and from work, they were already cyclists. They weren't coming into it as someone who was, driving or